Okay, so a lot of you people like this. Maybe you like this. Orange team shirt available now. Remember how St Kilda used to merge with any club in a 10-mile radius that looked at them funny? Well, they'd had a few more offers in the last 10 years. Before South Melbourne's move, St Kilda were approached to be the club to move to Sydney, but nothing came of it. They then received an offer in 1985, just before West Coast became a thing, to become the first WA based side. After that, they considered a name change right as Footscray were giving it some funny looks. Despite Lindsay Fox's work and the interest generated by Big Tony, the club was still running at a loss as the 90s loomed. Of course, the Waverley deal knocked a lot of that debt away, but for a moment a merger looked like it was the best option. The new VFL boss was offering a $6 million bounty for mergers to take place, and St Kilda went searching for lonely hearts. The first was the embattled Fitzroy. Even though the Saints had just survived the early 80s by the skins of their teeth and were still in the red, the Lions were facing extinction and they were reduced to ground sharing. What they did have was a side that beat St Kilda by 14 goals, including Paul Roos, Bernie Quinlan, Mick Conlon, and a young John Blakey and Gary Pert. The amalgamated club would be based at Moorabbin, but talks broke down very early in proceedings. There was one more suitor, though, an unlikely one, a club that had begun the same way as the Saints, but had taken a different path. Carlton, St Kilda's fellow initial whipping boys, had just failed to merge with another perennial loser in the early 1990s. Carlton president John Elliott had seen the big names move to the Saints and wanted to create the Death Star to end all Death Stars. Lockett, Winmar, Harvey, Lowe, Silvani, Kernahan, Bradley, Madden, Williams, all in the same team. It would have been unbeatable. Their home games would have been at Princes Park in the Carlton jersey, with away games in the Saints strip. The board would be a 50-50 split, and with the financial incentives the AFL was offering for mergers in its mad scramble at rationalisation, money troubles would be a thing of the past. So what stopped it? Well, thankfully, despite fielding the most prolific forward ever, St Kilda were just shit enough to make their board think the more successful Carlton were trying to take them over, which was only a half-truth at best. The two presidents did all they could to get it over the line, but thanks to this shiny cup, the Carlton Saints idea died in the water. Speaking of changing the name of things, the next big story can be traced back to the medal that Winmar won in St Kilda's first Lockettless year. By 1995, most of the foundation VFL clubs had named their best and fairest awards in honour of one of their favourite sons. The two who hadn't? Carlton and St Kilda, the original whipping boys. Carlton by this time had had a host of legends walk through their doors, so much so that choosing a single one was the hard part. But St Kilda? Yeah, they'd had Brownlow medalists, Coleman medalists, and even a premiership, but very few out-and-out legends that you could name such a medal for. Tony Lockett? Ian Stewart? They'd both left, somewhat acrimoniously. Barry Breen, maybe? Alan Jeans would be a candidate, but he was now known more for his work at the Hawks. So, nothing really happened until the mid-90s, when they lost someone special before his time. During the bad times of the intermission years, there was no player more distinctive, attention-grabbing, or spectacular at Moorabbin than the bright blonde, usually long-sleeved, Trevor Barker. His wiry frame was perfectly suited to taking hangers, but the 71-kilo Barker also had the bravery to run into packs of guys twice his size. His brave and aerial playing style was amazing to watch, but there was a reason why he was only able to play 15 games per season. He retired in 1989, having played more than any other player who never saw finals action. After his retirement, the old number one coached the local VFA team, the Sandringham Zebras, to 2 flags in 3 years. He had become the new right-hand man of new Saints head coach Stan Alves, taking the helm of a reserves team who, thanks to his mentorship, mostly went on to great things. He was being groomed for that top job, the patron saint of the 80s, the captain who did so much to save his club, would soon take the helm. It was perfect. As it turns out, it was too perfect. Whenever the Saints find a hero, it must be fleeting. This is their cross to bear, or at least it was at the time. Vic Cumberland became a missionary, Big Dave fought in the cruel wars, Daryl had to go home, Tony had to go anywhere else. Trevor didn't want to go. Sadly, he didn't have a choice. After a battle with colon cancer, he passed away just shy of his 40th birthday, showing just how beloved he was by the Saints faithful. His service attracted 6,000 people. He was honoured after his passing in 1996 with the Best and Fairest award being struck in his name. Barker was a man who inspired joy in those around him with a deep knowledge and deeper passion for the game. He was the personification of Fortius Quo Fidelius, a saint through and through. He would be inducted into the AFL Hall of Fame in 2019, and fittingly, Robert Harvey gave the induction speech. I've introduced you to Robert Harvey, right? I haven't. Oh, how embarrassing. Well, meet Robert. Robert was a prodigy in more ways than one. He was a great footballer and cricketer, following in the steps of legendary Uncle Neil. He was even nearly selected in the national under-17s, but chose footy in the end. And, funnily enough, in his first year on St Kilda's list, he played a reserve game alongside a young Shane Keith Warne. Just before Darryl Baldock joined the Saints as coach, he'd had a not insignificant stroke. Tony Lockett's was the only name he could really remember, as he put time and effort into turning his pet project into a Brownlow winner. As for our man Harvey, well, he kept calling him Rodney. He then told Rodney that from his debut in round 19 until the end of 1988, he could do whatever he wanted without the fear of being dropped, then they'd assess him. He must have done pretty well, because of the next 450 matches the Saints played over the next 20 years, Harvey would play in 83% of them. He was a local boy, a zone recruit from Seaford. He started out as a forward pocket and over the course of his first 3 years, quickly worked his way into the midfield. He came within a whisker of breaking the 700 disposal barrier in 1992, 20 years before it became fashionable. He had some performance dips after that, but he was still a very, very handy player. His passing was pinpoint, his speed was blistering, his long sleeves were worn far too rarely. He exuded class, and he did it even from his first game, at 16 years, 351 days old. Even at that age, he looked like he'd already played 100 games. He had his first 30 disposal game before the age of 18 in the 1980s. That's like if Jason Horne-Francis had a 40 disposal game next week. He did it again, 2 days before he was legally allowed to drink a beer to celebrate, kicking 4 goals to boot. By the time he'd hit drinking age in America, he'd added 3 40 disposal games to that too, plus winning 2 E.J. Whitten medals and the St Kilda Best and Fairest in a year where Lockett scored 132 goals. In fact, watch a 1992 Saints game if you want to know why Lockett scored that many. Lockett was getting nowhere near that amount without Harvey's laser-precise delivery. And he did all this while maintaining a kick-to-handball ratio of nearly 1.5. No cheap Tom Mitchell hand-pass rallies for him. He was a far cry fitness-wise from his former teammate in Warney. No tins of baked beans and durries for him. Harvey could run for days, and got so addicted to training that it began to tire him out for matches. And guess who taught him all about the importance of high training standards? Good old Trevor. I could go on and on about how good Robert Harvey was for so long. He was one of my favourite players after all. But I've given top billing to Fat Tony, so I'll just say this. Robert Harvey made me want to watch St Kilda play. He rose to stardom as Lockett left, right when St Kilda were crying out for a new legend. Without his steady hand and his handy skills, 1997, 2004, 2009 and 2010 don't happen. He was that important. Now, it's easy for me to say that Trevor Barker's passing lit something inside Harvey. Barker was a big influence on him, and in retrospect, the timelines match up. But I wasn't there, I can't say anything for certain. All I know is that in the 66 games before Barker's passing, he racked up 38 Brownlow medal votes. Pretty good going. In the 66 games after, he got 75. From round 10 1996, Robert Harvey was adjudged the best player in the AFL by a factor of nearly 2 to 1. 700 touches? Try 750. In fact, despite the disposal-mad figures of the modern era, Harvey's 1997 mark of 758 disposals is still a Saints record, and one of only 3 Saints to average 30 touches in a season. The others? 2016 Seb Ross and 1998 Robert Harvey. For individual games, 90s Harvey occupies half the Saints' top 20 all-time. Clearances? Forget about it. Harvey was on a different level. He won the Brownlow medal in both 1997 and 1998, still the last man to do it back-to-back 25 years on. He was truly a man playing before his time. He was a phenomenon. And because of him, St Kilda did this. This shouldn't happen. This doesn't happen. Of course, this being St Kilda, no one cared. Their last home game before the finals drew 26,000 people, leaving about 50,000 empty seats. Yeah, that's right. Finals. As in multiple. Despite finishing 10th in 1996, and despite starting 1997 1-4 with a 100-point loss, St Kilda went 13-3 over the rest of the season to sit atop the ladder heading into the final round by 0.5%. St Kilda had the easier draw, and Tony Lockett gave his old side a hand by booting 5 to limit the Cats to a 10-point win. All the Saints had to do now was get the 4 points against an expansion side, and of course, this being St Kilda, they trailed at half-time. A powerhouse performance by Adam Huskies of all people kept Port Adelaide in it, with only inaccurate kicking stopping them from claiming a lead at the final change. But then, as he'd done all year, Robert Harvey stepped up and powered his way to 40 touches for the 3rd time that season, everyone else in the league having combined for 5, and Jason Heatley provided the goals that put the Saints in front. And voila! The Saints become, by a measure of win percentage, the absolute worst minor premiers of all time. In 2022, their 15-7, 119.8% record would net them 6th, and only just. And their new forward line talisman fit right into this whole worst best team ever aesthetic. It's been 23 years since he played a game, and I still don't know what to make of Jason Heatley. A mature age recruit at West Coast, he scored 8 goals in 3 games over 3 years before he was cut. Apparently, he was too slight a figure for full forward. Here's just a small list of guys this small fry is heavier than. He actually got cut from Fitzroy's training squad for the same reasons. 1990s Fitzroy. Christ. What makes it all the more amazing is that Stan Alves, with pick 49 in a draft class that had Cam Mooney, Byron Pickett, Russell Robertson and Brad Scott still on the table, picked up Heatley. And it's even more amazing when you consider that on his debut in round 3, he took a not all that terrible Collingwood side and broke him in half. He kicked 5 goals 33 points. The Saints won by 7. This Fitzroy reject stopped the Saints from starting 0-5, earning a Brownlow vote for his efforts. And, well, he went nuts. Tony Modra, pictured here replacing my father, won the Coleman Medal in 1997. Excluding the prelim final that basically would end his career, he averaged 3.5 goals per game. Heatley, who'd played 3 senior games before 1997, averaged 3.65. He scored in every game and was deadly accurate aside from a bizarre 4 goals 8 in round 16, although in the qualifying final against the newly merged Brisbane Lions, he only managed 1 off 3 touches, his worst game by far. The Saints won though, as they were more than 2 minutes old. Their preliminary final though was against North Melbourne, who'd won this 12 months earlier. Here's a list of every player since 1994 to get 7 goals in a game against the reigning premiers. Short list. It's happened once in the last 13 years and 20 times since 1994. This list contains some of the finest forwards of all time: Lockett, Lloyd, Favola, and, for some reason, David Hale. It's a list too exclusive for Lance Franklin and Wayne Carey. 4 men have rung up a baker's half dozen on the reigning champs on 2 occasions across their careers. It took David Neitz 6 years. Matthew Lloyd took 5. It took the greatest player of the 90s, Gary Ablett Sr., just over a full season. Jason Heatley did it twice in 76 days. He did what 79% of the 500 club members who'd played most of their career in this period failed to do outright in about the same time as the lifespan of a tadpole, having only 22 games under his belt. He would score 4 bags of 6 or more in a 63-game career. 3 came against Kangaroos sides with a Premiership Cup that hadn't aged a full year in their trophy cabinet. He was a single missed chance in 2000 away from being the only 3-time entrant on this list. Thanks to Heatley and Robert Harvey's 15th 30-touch performance that season, St Kilda beat the best team of the late 90s comfortably. They sat back the next day and watched the second preliminary final to see who they'd play in their first grand final since colour television arrived in Australia. It's a tough call who you'd want to play. The Bulldogs' leaky defence was the 5th worst in the league, and their percentage of 101.8 was the worst by a top 3 team in, well, a while. Adelaide's defence was the best in the league, but they'd failed to score 100 points for 7 weeks, a mark St Kilda failed to hit only once in that span. Regardless, St Kilda were better than both. As the Bulldogs kept the Crows at arm's length, neutrals romanticised a match-up between 2 Victorian teams who both hadn't won flags since before man walked on the moon. Tony Liberatore lined up and kicked the sealer. Or so he thought. Of their last 5 wins, Adelaide had trailed at half-time in 4 of them. And so the Crows slowly set about making it 5 from 6, suffocating the Bulldogs' running movement and counter-attacking viciously, running out 2-point winners. But the Saints weren't worried. They were the highest scoring team, playing a side who were allowing teams free half-time leads. For the first time, a player in the tricoloured stripes would lift the cup. Except they wouldn't. St Kilda debuted this as their jersey in the 1996 pre-season cup. Known as the Crusader jersey, this striking outfit, based on the Saints' only good logo, quickly became a fan favourite, and winning the competition that year sure seemed to help that. Almost as if to alleviate the lack of success that came from the 1996 regular season wearing the regular jersey, St Kilda took the radical step of adopting the Crusader as their home kit for 1997. Remember, of course, the last time they changed their kit this drastically was due to World War I. Teams had altered their colours and stripe widths every so often, but no club had outright changed the style of their home jerseys since the Hawks in 1950, and no, the Swans don't count. Safe to say, it worked, and the Saints looked pretty rad doing it. The look would last until 2001 and would be brought back in 2022 as a Clash jersey, and I want one. Really badly, actually. But that's enough of the fashion show. Back to 1997. Robert Harvey won Brownlow Medal number 1, and the Saints' grand final prep was... Stan Alves made them do a weird dance, but the rest was going well. Smoother than 1965, at least. Right up until the Friday night before the game. Nicky Winmar's father, whom he was very close to, had been ill the whole final series. Unfortunately, he couldn't hang on for the grand final. After some debate, it was decided to keep Winmar in the playing squad, even though he hadn't slept a wink the night before the grand final. Then, hours later, Stewie Lowe had a family tragedy of his own. Combined with the injury to Spider Everett, the Saints had basically lost 3 of their top 4 scorers. And the other one was Jason fucking Heatley. The Saints began shakily, unable to get the ball out of their backline, but steady to allow Heatley to kick the opener. He nails another soon after. The Saints weren't the only team to miss a target up forward. Tony Modra had gone down with the ACL injury that would effectively end his time in Adelaide the week before. Adelaide had no ready-made replacement for him. The best Malcolm Blight could do was throw a defender forward and hope for the best. Shane Ellen, a man who hadn't scored all season, was chosen as the man to replace a god. It was ludicrous. It would be like if St Kilda had to replace Locker in 88 and 89 with Danny Frawley. After Heatley's second, Bruce McAvaney ponders why Ellen's even down there. Shane Ellen soon shows him. Then a clever little rope-a-dope hands St Kilda a 50-metre penalty which gets touched on the mark, a super rare way to waste a golden chance. The Crows take it the length of the ground and eventually score through Carlton reject Troy Bond and then Ellen, who'd scored a goal on average every 13 games in his career. This was his second of the day, and then he hit the post 3 minutes later, nearly adding a third. But the Saints didn't let that get them down. At the same time, Clay Sampson and Rod Jamieson were both benched with injuries and both would not return. Adelaide, for the rest of the game, were 2 men down with only 1 active rotation. Time to strike. Burke, who would go on to have a ridiculous stat line, kicks out to Harvey. Harvey's run would prove valuable early. He would end up with 37 disposals, and he does something similar here as he frees space for Austin Jones, who ran. He would go on to play the most games by far of any player St Kilda got in the Tony Locker trade, and these long runs were his trademark. He gets some help from Tim Cook, and I just want to go on a tangent just quickly. This fellow got dropped from Fitzroy the previous year. Yeah, the team that died and had 1 win all season. He wasn't good enough to make that side. Thanks to injuries to Everett and Lazar Vidovic, the third choice Cook won the ruck duel in the prelim against Adam Simpson and John Longmire. God, this final series was so bizarre. Anyway, he's in a grand final now in a career rise so sudden it would give most people the bends. Jones keeps running, and a shepherd from Barry Hall allows him the room to perform this nice dummy kick, turning Darren Jarman and I think Peter Caven inside out. He handballs to Andrew Thompson, who fumbles in an ugly fashion. He has no choice but to handball back to Jones while holding off Jarman. Jones runs to about 49 out and drills it with his left, which is his opposite foot, to score what has to be the finest goal any Saint has or will ever score in a grand final. This cuts the Adelaide lead to 2, heading into quarter time. Then, in the second half, Barry Hall went berserk. He took a defender who would limit the great Wayne Carey to a single major in the 1998 grand final and scored 3 on him in 4 minutes, each goal vastly different from the last. Amazingly though, the plucky Crows held their composure, with Bond nabbing a goal and assisting another to put the Crows within a kick. Enter Robert Harvey. He was more of a creator than a scorer, setting up attacks with beautiful short to mid-range passing. But toward the end of the term, he snapped his 18th goal of the season, a beautiful shot as well, to extend the margin to 12. A late miss saw the half-time margin rise to 13. Now 13 points is by no means an unassailable margin. Hall had scored 18 points in the time it takes to boil an egg. But typically teams that lead grand finals at half-time stay in front, especially minor premiers. What these stats don't take into account though is the freakishness of Malcolm Blight's tactics. Firstly, he screamed at his team to wake them the hell up. Then, inspired by a performance the previous week, he threw Andrew McLeod into the midfield. He'd been impactful at halfback already today, garnering 8 touches in the first, but in the middle, he dominated. The forward line, inaccurate in the first half, had been rearranged. Nigel Smart moved forward while Ellen returned to defence. Bond scored the first of the half with Lowe responding in kind. Then, the fates decided who would win the match. When Ian Tampion launched that long bomb in 1958, the only consequence was the embarrassment it gave St Kilda's defence. When Chad Rintoul launched one from 65, the fallout was far more dire. Max Hudgton is a well-loved figure at St Kilda. His career was bookended by minor premierships. Only Joel Selwood has repeated that feat in the AFL era. This was that first bookend, and in his 17th game he was the least experienced Saint. 3 Crows had less experience. One was the very man who'd booted that footy in hope. If it were just these two, in isolation, Maxi wins out. But a man who once did this played one of the smartest moves of the match. He moved Maxi off the ball, and it went through. This was a lesson. Guard your line, guard it hard. Don't let the opposition get cheapies by pulling your back 6 too high up. It took St Kilda 5 minutes to forget it. Brett James lifts one from 55 that falls short, and Shane Ellen is there. He made St Kilda pay, and by this point the Saints were fighting against the tide. And then Malcolm Blight decides to add a tsunami into the mix. Loyal Gaz-man viewers know what's coming next. By the 14-minute mark of the third quarter, Darren Jarman had snuck 2 shots on goal from the centre. Both had missed. He'd fluffed his lines a few times with his delivery as well, so Malcolm Blight decided his influence would be best used up front. And 15 minutes into the third, he outpaces Jamie Shanahan to mark and kick his first, allowing Hell to do many things. First, it boils over, as Shane Ellen eclipses his total from his first 37 games in career game 38 by launching one from the 50-metre arc. It then freezes over as Peter Caven, the Crows' full back, snaps a goal like he's Dustin Martin. Then Hell presents in the Saints themselves, Hell channeling through Hall as he chests the ball over St Kilda's goal line, robbing them of a crucial 5 points 2 seconds before the final change. Then it breaks loose. A flurry of goals. Jarman, Burke, Jarman, Jarman, Jarman. Within 8 minutes, a 2-kick game became a 5-kick game. Peckett and Heatley clawed points back, but Ellen's 5th added salt to St Kilda's many, many wounds, and then Jarman added his 6th goal to allow Hell its final act of a hectic half hour, admitting St Kilda as a tenant. St Kilda lives in hell now, but they weren't going quietly. They would be dragged kicking and screaming into apartment 666. the Saints didn't hesitate in getting back to winning ways. They won 5 of the first 6 in 1998, including getting revenge on the Crows in their grand final rematch. They fell a bit but managed to spark a 5-game winning streak that concluded with a win against the team that was a Tony Liberatore goal away from facing them in that big dance. That win put the Saints top. They were back. And then North beat them by 11 goals. The Saints immediately went into a tailspin, winning only 2 more games for the season and suffering 10 goal losses to Adelaide and the last placed Hawks. Ouch. Their final game before falling into 6th place was a 1-point loss to the 5.5 win Lions. You know when you break up with someone and you bump into them on the street and they're doing really well and you're kind of pissed off because you're worried they'll win the breakup? Sucks, doesn't it? Tony Lockett had gone to the club he'd bullied more than any other, and yet he was treated like a normal guy. He'd gotten away from the Victorian media bubble and, in doing so, he saved the Sydney franchise. The Swans too had made and lost a grand final, and the big fella had motored towards 1,200 goals. He'd just won Coleman Medal number 4 and finished 100 goals season number 6. The Saints had lost all but one game against their former idol, and now he welcomed his old club into his new home. The Swans weren't a great team in 1998. They were one note, solely reliant on an ageing key forward who was rapidly becoming past his best. Remind you of anyone? And yet the Saints, who were 40 minutes away from being last year's premiers, were lucky to hang with them. St Kilda had beaten the Swans by 100 points earlier that season on the SCG, and yet a tight first term turned into a 22-point halftime lead for Lockett's Swans in the wet. St Kilda needed to turn on the heat. A missed Stafford shot early on turned into a Winmar win in a tough contest up the other end. 16 points the difference. Jones clears from the centre bounce and finds Nicky again. 10 points. And then our man steps up. Like I said earlier, Harvey wasn't a big goal scorer, but he scored goals in big moments. This fine finish in those fine long sleeves was St Kilda's 3rd in 4 minutes and brought the gap to 4 points. Game on, Tony. Schwass hits back. The Saints missed 3 high-pressure chances in quick succession before Jason Daniels helps the Saints get within 1. Of course, this being St Kilda, they concede immediately. To be fair though, late 90s Mickey O was just an unstoppable wizard. Heatley gets one back and Sydney miss a couple in the grimy wet conditions, otherwise known as a typical Sydney fucking evening, to bring the margin to 3 at the final change, including a narrow miss from our old friend Anthony. This could have and probably should have been a bigger gap if not for some stoic defending from big bad bustling Barry Hall and the helmeted hero Nathan Burke. The final quarter was Sydney at their worst. Tony Lockett had the first chance, and the man with more goals than all the Saints on field bar Stewie Lowe combined does this. The Saints take it down the other end, and Nicky Winmar, 20 days out from turning 33, does this. Wow. St Kilda hit the lead for only the 2nd time since early in the first term. Mickey O misses a measured chance and Spider Everett responds with a goal. It seemed like the Saints would answer every Swans mistake with harsh punishment. Luff misses an easy shot. St Kilda looked to rebound, but Paul Roos, the man they could have had if they merged, stops them. He lobs one in, and David Sierakowski, son of 1966 hero Brian, slams it back out again. Big Sierra would be proud. At least until the next entry, where he gives Mickey O a big old shove. He passes to Stafford, who goals. The Swans are 1 point up, with 6 minutes left. Ruse nearly lands a killing blow trying to find Lockett, but Zilla and Young team up to rush it through. 2 points down. Peter Philandia then gets it. He steers it left. The Swans, typical of their 1990s, were trying to just throw this thing away. The Saints punch it forward. Ruck contest. Spider is mortined. The Saints cop 2 friendly fire falcons in a row. Swans rebound. Game over. Except it wasn't. Thompson finds himself free. He puts a mongrel in to Winmar's supreme disadvantage, but he beats Worf because it's Nicky Winmar. St Kilda's victory is assured for about 3 frames. Then, on frame 4, Mickey O enters stage left and puts a bump on Winmar, jarring his body to the left and his kick just to the right. Now it was game over. This depleted, tired Saints side weren't going to do it the hard way. Not a chance. In their semi-final against Melbourne, while in the lead, Barry Hall decided to try and kill a man. The resulting scuffle neutralised St Kilda's momentum, and their 1998 ended. Stan Alves, now seen as a one-season wonder, was ousted. And may I remind you, this was a bloke who was top of the ladder about 3 months ago. Despite being only the 3rd man to coach St Kilda to a grand final, his win percentage was only 48.26. Not even good enough to be in the top 10 for coaches who'd spent multiple years at Moorabbin, or Junction Oval, or Waverley. Despite Robert Harvey doing all he could in 1999, the Saints had plunged themselves into a death dive, best summed up by their round 12 match against the Hawks. They were 7-4 and had won 5 of the last 6 games. 3 minutes after quarter time, the eternally underrated Tony Brown dishes his 17th disposal to our good friend Lowy. He kicks his 2nd goal. Not a huge deal in itself, but it's St Kilda's 11th. They lead by 63 over a Hawks side that will come a Stephen Kretiak goalie save away from a top 8 finish. This match will last another 89 minutes. At that rate, the Saints would win by 214, with Brown having around 60 touches. Of course, this being St Kilda, things started to go wrong. The Hawks clawed back some ground before the half, with things not helped by Gavin Mitchell giving away a 50-metre penalty. Hope the Saints don't do that again. Still, the halftime gap was 44 points. Only 8 teams had ever come back from that margin to win, with all of those being in the 25-minute quarter era. The game was still as good as won. And then, a young Nathan Thompson turned into prime Jason Dunstall, kicking 2 in the first 5 minutes and somewhat unluckily getting a holding call to cancel out a 3rd. Daniel Harford then transformed into prime Jason Ackermanis, kicking 2 great goals on the run. This came in between 2 goals coming straight from 50-metre penalties against St Kilda big men, with Everett doubling his money with a 100-metre penalty. Thompson got a 3rd for the term, with Lowe poking his head back in to see what had happened. Poor bloke must have felt like Troy from Community. Heatley and Everett repaired some damage, giving the Saints a bit of breathing space. This breathing space turned out to be less than a billionaire's submarine could store, as Hawthorn nailed 2 goals in the final 44 seconds, including one from Nick Holland. Forgot he existed for a second. Look at that scoreworm though. This 33 minutes was like a toddler bouncing down a staircase, and it was about as macabre to watch. Holland would give the Hawks a frankly well-deserved lead 10 minutes into the last, with both sides missing chances. Brown was cited for the first time since late in the 2nd quarter, having fallen off the face of the planet. St Kilda then had 3 chances. Our man, our hero, blazed an absolute sitter wide. Barry Hall missed what would normally be his bread and butter. Then a bald man with an odd name broke a hawk ankle before shaping up and hitting the target. Unfortunately, his target was the goalpost. And guess what? Hawthorn rebound the ball all the way up from the kick-in, with Ben Dixon kicking the sealer. Only 2 sides, 2 really bizarre sides, have since beaten the Hawks' halftime comeback, the 9th biggest of all time. And that 63-point gap early in the second was the biggest comeback from any VFL-AFL team from any point ever. Only 2001 Essendon would ever beat it, and as I've noted in the past, they were a team for the ages. This Hawthorn side, however, missed the finals because they couldn't win a 5-on-3 8 metres from goal. The 2001 Roos were outclassed by the genius of Kevin Sheedy, a Hall of Famer. The 1999 Saints were outclassed by Ken Judge, perhaps the most mediocre coach of all time, and a man who was ultimately responsible for this footballing atrocity. Losing to that, like that, broke the Saints. They never recovered. Including that game, they went 3-10 for the rest of the season, missing the finals by a single win. If they'd even just maintained that 63-point gap, they make it to September. As such, the only highlight from 1999's second half was an umpire taking St Kilda's best intercept mark of the year. They lost Winmar, Lappin, Shanahan and Smith, leaving huge experience and talent gaps. Their first pick from that 1999 draft retired within 3 years after getting into a pub brawl. They were done. That Hawks loss killed them. They'd blown their chance. 1997 was just the second time to that point, and the third time in their first 150 years of existence that they would top the home and away ladder. All of them, so far, had meant nothing on Grand Final Day. And yet, their lone success came after they scraped second place with a last round win against a crap Hawks side. It shouldn't be a surprise though. 120 years before that day in September, St Kilda had ground out a tough loss to a far superior Essendon. But they'd impressed writers of the day with their pluck and tenacity, the Australasian going so far as to say that the Saints exemplified this old, Bible verse, fittingly enough, that the advantages either side had in a St Kilda contest didn't necessarily guarantee success. And it's true. In all of these contests, St Kilda either started as the favourites or gained a commanding position. In all of these contests, St Kilda had, or at least should have had, the lead. And, of course, in all of them, they lost. This one, their one triumph, was the one they weren't favoured for. They won it. That's how they worked. And according to this article, that's the way they've worked for 12 whole decades. The band TISM is more culturally important than you'd realise. After the breaking up of the Doug Anthony All-Stars, someone needed to fill the gap as the premier Australian comedy band, and TISM were more than willing to oblige. An anarchic dark comedy band, one of their most enduring hits was 1995's Greg the Stop Sign, which lampooned the Victorian Transport Accident Commission. Yeah, don't know why. Apparently one of the members of the band was a raging Saints fan, and so the music video was mostly set in St Kilda's actual club rooms in Moorabbin. Yeah, those inspirational quotes with spelling mistakes were real. I thought they were ironic. The video, filmed during training, of course, featured 4 actual St Kilda players, half of which would play on that fateful day in 1997. The others? Well, one was one of the steak knives received in the locker trade, and the other was a man named Chris Hemley. Taken at pick 13, itself received as part of the Lockett trade, Hemley would only feature once for the Saints, a match against Adelaide where he started on the bench after being a late inclusion for Shanahan. He got subbed on with under 6 minutes to go and never played at AFL level again. He went absolutely beautifully statless, only touching the ball for a fleeting moment. His football career, all told, was about 16 seconds long. It's so insubstantial that it can fit inside a YouTube short comfortably. Is it the shortest career ever captured? I can't be certain, and let me know if you have a candidate. Post-game footage of him looking sad adds exactly 10 seconds, a third of which is just his elbow blocking Andy Jarman's bald head. You know what's just a little bit longer than that? His appearance in Greg the Stop Sign, coming in at 10.2 seconds, incidentally twice as long as poor Justin Peckett, the only guy to immediately volunteer to be in that video. Of all the recorded footage that exists of Chris Hemley in a St Kilda jersey, the TISM video makes up about a quarter. If we narrow that down to quality footage, i.e. where his whole head is visible in frame, these pie slices become worryingly even. Yeah, St Kilda's first round pick they received as part of losing their greatest forward ever, who was on AFL lists for 4 years, had his face on camera on a football field for 1 second longer than a cameo appearance he had in a music video for a comedy band. This man is my hero, and he should be yours too. You see, Chris Hemley's sweatless shift on an exercise bike actually helped his club in the long run. See this sign? That wasn't one of the cringy slogans on the wall. This was a real cry for help. The Save Our Saints campaign had been started by President Andrew Plimpton. Even after accepting cash to move to Waverley, the Saints were still $900,000 in debt. This campaign gave Saints fans a clear goal: raise funds by the end of the 1995 season, or we'll have to merge with someone, which is how those Carlton talks started. For the privilege of filming nearly 2/3 of the video at Moorabbin, TISM paid the club an unlisted amount of money. Not only that, they performed at a benefit concert at season's end, with assorted other acts raising $40,000. Both the video and concert raised crucial attention to the SOS cause, which, combined with some back-of-house manoeuvres I won't bore you with details of, erased enough of the debt for St Kilda to march on. Yeah, the Saints survived the 1990s in no small part thanks to a band whose members were named things like Jock Cheese and John St Penis, and a song about car crashes. Ironically, in 1996, a car crash knocked St Kilda out of finals contention. Round 10, 1996, Waverley third quarter. The very game that kick-started Robert Harvey's rise to being elite in a way that no one's really done since. The Saints are down, because of course they are, and then, all of a sudden, the lights go out. Some idiot had smashed into a transmission tower and cut the power for the whole neighbourhood. Cue a pitch invasion, fans setting fire to the ground, and a stoppage of the game. And, okay, fine. The car crash story isn't true, as much as I want it to be. It was just a standard power failure with the emergency backup generator doing an impression of St Kilda's offense and failing entirely. The stadium announcer, in a flash of idiocy, decided to tell everyone it was a car crash with no evidence, and then went on to state how empty his head was, and the story stuck. Regardless, this whole thing was unique, a game stopped by the lights going out, until at least a few months ago, thanks Brisbane. The next morning, the AFL debriefed on exactly what to do here. This was the first match in the modern era to not have been completed on the day it began. They could simply abandon the game and give no score, But at this point, Essendon were fighting for the top 4 and needed all the percentage they can get. It would be unfair, much as Essendon's solution was, which was to keep the score at the point of the stoppage, as it was possible that St Kilda could have closed the margin and gained valuable percentage or even premiership points in their fight for 8th. Should they replay the game entirely? Well, Essendon, who'd led the whole match, opposed that. Shocking. Both sides did agree that each team should get full premiership points from the affair, and this being the AFL, they said no to the only thing the two sides agreed on. So the match simply continued from where they'd left off on the following Tuesday. Despite Essendon making 5 player changes for the remaining quarter and a bit, the Saints scored the first goal. They would then have more scoring shots than Essendon in the last, but the Dons pulled away as Lowe and Jones kicked like the lights were still off. An exhausted St Kilda side then blew a game to an incompetent Richmond. This debacle cost them, arguably, 8 premiership points. They missed the 1996 finals by 6. This was the way of the Saints. This was their default state, sucking like a turbocharged Dyson. Every time they ventured out of their comfort zone, they'd get smacked down and return to their comfortable abyss. But the way they sucked varied each time. In the early days, it was simple and total incompetence. In the interwar years, it was crumbling from within. After the wars, it was just them fading into the background. After their tilt at glory, it was struggling to recover from the best thing they'd ever had and almost losing everything in the attempt. But now, after their latest rise, they had seemed to learn how to suck in exactly the right way. For the first time in their history, the Saints would attempt a draft-based rebuild. They would do a good job of it. So much so that they'd finally pose a threat to someone. The Saints would go on the hunt for their first rival.